Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Connection. Today I have Dr. Yoav Fromer with me. He is the head of the Center for the Study of the United States at Tel Aviv University and a fellow in the School of Government and Diplomacy. Dr. Fromer holds a PhD in politics and history from New York's The New School, and his work has been published in journals such as Review of Politics, Modern Intellectual History, American Jewish History, and the Journal of American Studies. His latest book, which came out in 2020 with the University Press of Kansas, is called The Moderate Imagination, The Political Thought of John Updike and the Decline of New Deal Liberalism. Now, Yoav also happens to teach the wildly popular course, Modernity and Its Discontents, through the International Liberal Arts Bachelor's Program here at TAU. Now, I've heard from several students that it's been their favorite course, and that piqued my interest and curiosity enough to ask Yoav to join me here today. So welcome, Yoav.
Thank you for having me.
So whether it's a fair question or not, I think question number one is, why do you think it's such a popular course?
First of all, I'm always happy to hear this because every year, this is the 10th year now that I've been teaching it. And even after 10 years, and I've had obviously a lot of positive feedback, it's always great to hear that the students genuinely are still connecting with it because I'll be honest, there's the more time passes, I ask myself how relevant are these things exactly because of the technology and the smartphones that and ChatGPT now that has entered the conversation that it challenges us as teachers and it always forces us and forced me actually to actually always think if I need to refresh the course and change it, but it's primarily because of the overwhelming positive student feedback. I know we're doing something right, so I'm sticking with it.
Okay. You do raise some good points, but before we sort of jump into some of those questions, could you give me an overview of the course?
Yeah. So I always tell students this I try not to be too presumptuous or anything, but I think at the end of the day, this isn't just a regular course. And I try to make it more than just an academic experience because I think it's an intellectual experience. And again, without sounding pompous, I think it's a personal and an emotional experience that every student has to undergo when you get a liberal arts a liberal arts degree, right? And I take the idea of the liberal arts very seriously, especially today, because of how the market works. And at the end of the day, most students come to the university first and foremost for professional reasons, right? And strategic reasons to get a degree, to get a good job. And that's fair. And I understand that. I respect that. But I also think that a college education, especially a liberal arts education, demands some other things. It means that what we're doing isn't only instilling in students certain skills that they could take to the job market. That, of course, that's important. But I think students are students. They're future employees. They're part of the labor force, but they're citizens and they're human beings. And I say this with the highest respect in that sense. And I think we need to help prepare them because to be a citizen and to be a human being in the 21st century is harder, I think, than it was in the past. And just very broadly, that's the point, right? I think that students need to get certain skills to cope with the challenges of modernity, right? And that's what the course does. And it does so in a very historical and cultural manner that goes back to those great texts, right? In order to try to find a way to deal with challenges and problems that obviously they've evolved and changed in the last 200-300 years, but at the core, they're still the same questions, right? That how do we deal as individuals in a modern world? And that just in a nutshell is kind of what the course tries to do.
Okay. So it's providing that context to help us understand a little bit more how we can navigate modernity. Given that, how would you define modernity in the context of your course?
Well, first of all, it's always a question that everyone raises in day one, right? What is modernity? And even that sense, I can't give you one answer. And that, in a way, that's the journey of the course, that we evolve and we try to understand what is modernity. So on one hand, it's a historical epoch, right? We're looking at a certain time frame with time and space also. And that's also a question. Is modernity only something that emerges in Western Europe, right? And then also kind of is exported to North America and the colonies that the European empires kind of create. So is it only that era that has certain changes? Is it a material existence, right? Is it the material changes first and foremost driven by technology and the scientific revolution, or is it a state of mind, a sensibility, right? A way of looking at the world, and I think in a way it's all these things together. But that is the journey that I try to lead students through. But I myself, and I always joke when I tell students this, but in a way this is this is a replacement for therapy, right?
Okay.
Instead of having therapy, you can just, the fact that I have the privilege, and really I see it as one of the great privileges of my life, to be able to come every year, to come back to these great texts, right? To Kant and Voltaire and Marx and Balzac and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and so forth, and read them and reread them and rethink them and discuss them with students, most, if not all of whom are brilliant in their own manner. And every year I learn something new. I'm not just saying that's one of those things I would say.
Okay.
And I think about these texts in a new way. So that's part of why I think this is such an incredible experience.
Okay. So it's a bit of an expansive look at what modernity can be. And in terms of the timeline of the course, some of the philosophers you've mentioned, so Kant, you're starting with the Enlightenment and you're going into the 20th, 21st century. So how important is it for you to, as you unpack what modernity might mean and the multiple definitions of modernity, how important is it to have sort of that bird's eye view or like grand sweeping look at modernity from the 17th century up until the post-war World War II period?
I think the title of the course is Modernity and Its Discontent, right? And in a way, it's framed in a way to show the promise, right? And then again, maybe the disappointment. I don't want to say collapse, but certainly, right? We start off in a way, right? If we're thinking about the modern experience as it has emerged in the West, and part of this is also a story of geography, right? And one of the things we discuss in the course is modernity Western, right? Can't we have multiple modernities, right? Can't modernity, or can modernity sustain itself in other places, right? There's certainly an Asian modernity, right? So think about Japan or China, some of the most modern countries in the world, right? But then one of these questions is, right, is modernity only material? Right? Can you only have a material, technological, capitalist, highly developed industrial or post-industrial economy now without having the values and the institutions that bred them? Right? What happens if you have a technologically advanced country like Germany in the 1930s and 40s of the 20th century, but that cannot sustain the institutions and ideals, first and foremost, democratic liberalism or social democracy? What happens, right? And there's obviously a threat there, right? That is what happens in the Third Reich. That what happens with Imperial Japan. So these are, and that's some of the broader questions. And I think one of the things that I try to get students to understand, and why I bring them up to the 21st century, is that in a world that takes for granted that technology is a wonderful thing, and it is. Right, it is certainly, and obviously Tao is one of the leaders in entrepreneurship and technological innovation. Right, we have to understand that it bears a cost, that it forces us to sacrifice certain things. That, of course, doesn't undermine the development of technology, but it forces us to be much more responsible and aware, right, in how we develop it and how we use it. Of course, now with AI and ChatGPT, these questions are even more urgent.
Okay. Do you think it's possible today to even separate our thinking from, I guess, our anchoring in modernity? Is it so all-encompassing that...
I think one of the great struggles of our time still, and again, this is a very, large, broad historical view. If I'm thinking about Western history, but even global history of the last 300 years, in the sweeping arc of modernity, I think it is the question of dealing with modernity. If you break down all the contemporary problems, certainly in Israel today, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously in Israeli society around religion, right? That's one of the fundamental dilemmas of modernity. What do we do? Because one of the hallmarks of modernity is emerging out of religion, or a certain perception of religion, right? These are, of course, a lot of these questions are contested, and the course is a I don't want to say it's a debate, but it's a conversation, and it lends itself to arguing, or at least discussing, because there are no answers, right? That's one of the things I always tell students, right? That I have no answers. All I'm going to give you is more and more questions.
Okay.
But you have to ask yourself these questions, and that's what the course does. It forces you. So just coming back to your question then about something like religion. These are the fundamental questions that we're still dealing with today, 300 years after, right? After 250 years after Kant and the Enlightenment thinkers who were trying to break away from looking at the world, right, kind of through the monotheistic, through the church, certainly in Western Europe, or even in Judaism, right, through orthodoxy, and then placing ourselves as individuals in the center of the universe, and the questions of agency. Mm-hmm. Right? What does that mean? And I think these questions, when they emerged kind of 300 years ago, more or less in the 18th century, but they're still with us today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Going back to that idea that modernity can mean a lot of different things. It's looking at it from a Western sensibility, but you can look at it more expansively too from other cultures and traditions. But if we are to sort of take that Western trajectory, I'd even like to take a step back and just some of the major themes related to modernity. So from my understanding, in the 17th century with the Enlightenment, it's about the age of reason. And so you talk about civilization and the development of civilization as sort of going in this direction related to reason, democracy, technical development. You could probably do a much better job than me, but can you sort of step back and just talk about some of the major themes related to the development of modernity?
Sure. So when there's a historical context when I break down modernity. Obviously, there's first and foremost there's the intellectual history, and for me that's the most important thing. The difference in looking at the world. Right. And, Max Weber, the German sociologist, called it the moment of disenchantment. And I think I like that because it's suddenly you're looking at the stars and you're not looking at the stars the same way, people used to look at the stars before that moment. It's that epiphany, right? And I'm using that personal example, but this is a sweeping trend that begins obviously among elites, right? It takes a couple of 100 years for it to kind of trickle down, but it's looking at the world differently and placing ourselves in the middle. There's that line, right? I think it's from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, right? The fault lies not in the stars, but in ourselves, right? I think Cassius tells Brutus this after they kill Caesar. But anyway, that's that moment where everything is flipped. It's inverted because the Greek tragedy, the ancient world, always suggested that we don't have agency, right? That's the point of Greek tragedy, and I always begin with that line because that means that someone else is always responsible for fate, on a personal but also civilizational level, right? And I think the transformation of modernity on an intellectual level is that, wait, suddenly it's us. That bears a huge historical and psychological weight. That suddenly, people understand, that changes the way everything works, the way we respond to our society, we live our lives, obviously socially, politically, economically. So that's the intellectual shift. But as you suggest, right, modernity is also economic. Certainly the transition from an agrarian feudalist society to capitalism, to markets, to global trade as the central engine, right? And what that means, that entails also, the division of labor, the change in how we work out of the family. It used to be, right, in most of Western Europe, right? If you have a family-based economy, you're tied to the land, right? Suddenly, urbanization, right? All the great sociological changes. So that's, right, we have the economic, the sociological changes. Capitalism that obviously leads to industrialism and in the late 20th century, post-industrialism, right? And you have the political changes, the consolidation of nation states, modern bureaucracy, and of course, liberal democracy that eventually emerges in North America and Western Europe. and also cultural. Obviously, all of these things are tied together. Modernity as a new form of literature, of music, of art. We do a lot of... This is a very interdisciplinary course because I don't think you can understand romanticism by just reading a Goethe, which we do. We read Goethe, but we listen to Beethoven's Fifth, and we look at the art of Caspar David Friedrich, right? Kind of the German romantics, because everything goes together, right? It's part of kind of the broader picture. That's why I think you have to look at all these different trends.
Okay. Now, in terms of the discontents or the disenchantment, do you see that, or the way you talk about it in the course, is that something that is very bound up with modernity from the beginning? Is it an outcome? How do you approach the discontents of modernity?
Here, this is the second part of the course. I try not to depress students, and I tell them, I don't want you to give up, or I don't want to depress. I just want to make you aware, right? I just want you to think about it critically. And so I have all these students who come to me, oh my God, after you, because it's a very heavy load, because suddenly we read Kafka and we read Dostoevsky, and they get very depressed. And Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and it is dark. And I say, well, okay, so don't give up on modernity, but just be more careful. Think about it more critically. So this is one of the great questions, right? Was the discontent, was the collapse, the internal destruction mechanism inherent in modernity? Could it have been avoided? I don't know. I always think about modernity through a tragic lens. Much of my scholarship, also I read about American politics, is through the lens of tragedy. And in that sense, I think modernity is an expression of human tragedy, because we tried to do so much, and it has so much potential. And we begin, the 18th and 19th centuries are the age of utopia. This is the great moment where you could harness reason and science and liberate humankind, right? But that what I just said, that same, justification is also unfortunately leads to all of these dystopian, totalitarian regimes, right? Certainly the Soviet Union and communist China and so forth. So it's always that question, and we end the course with the Holocaust, with the gulags, and with the atom bombs, right? And it's that great question of how is it possible that the same forces of science that liberated mankind and really just transformed our life, and just in terms of health and longevity, right, and the quality of life, which has expanded and improved just tenfold, just remarkably. So how is it possible that the same ideas that bred all the wonderful things of modernity are the same ideas that end up also creating the atom bomb, right, and all these weapons of mass destruction, and all these forces that take the potential for good, and right, they invert them and they lend themselves to catastrophe, and that's that inherent tension.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that it's a very interdisciplinary course. So you bring in a lot of art, whether it's visual art, whether it's music, whether it's literature. And so what is art's role in helping us to understand maybe even that very complicated relationship that you've set up between modernity and these outcomes that in some ways are catastrophic?
So I think you're right. You touched on the word complicated. Text, or obviously we look at text, that's what we do in the liberal arts, but they can only get us so far. There's a certain emotional power that art and music have that words just don't have, right? Words have a lot of their own power, but it's at those moments of complexity that art is able to get across certain messages, not through the mind, but through the heart, I think, and the sentiment, in a way that words aren't always capable of doing. And also remember, we're living in the 21st century. Students are much more comfortable looking at images, right? That's the world. We live in a world of images. We have since the last 40, 50 years. And I think there's something about, if I just think of some of the images, if we're talking about romanticism, then poetry and literature, it is a very important part in representing that. But when you look at the images of Caspar David Friedrich's perceptions of nature, that power and that powerlessness of human beings in the face of these forests and mountains that Friedrich and oceans that Friedrich paints so dramatically. Or you listen to Beethoven's Fifth, right? That, I think, right, that conveys certain sentiments that words can't always express.
Right. So you've given two examples of romantic artists right there. And, one of the major themes related to romanticism and modernity has to do with this longing for nature in terms of the discontent. And so that turning towards the what nature offers us in terms of its implications for the divine, its implications for anything that isn't rational in a way. So how do you tackle, or how does nature, the relationship between nature and modernity sort of play into?
It's a huge question because, right, nature, I mean, it has also the religious ramifications, but, the story of modernity, in a way, is also the shift in our relationship to nature, because up until this moment, we accept nature in a way, right? And we are bound by the laws of nature. Also, just in historical thinking, right? The way we think about history is tied to nature. The seasonal, the cyclical. The Greeks, the Romans, they thought about nature in a cyclical. About history, like nature, in a cyclical manner. Mm-hmm. One of the things that changes with modernity is also the way we think about history. Suddenly it's progressive, it's linear, it moves away from the cycles of nature, right? And here you see reflected the changes that you mentioned, because modernity changes the relationship between man and nature. It lends, I think it does two things. First, man conquers nature, right? That is part of the modern story. What romanticism does, I think, and this is the way I set it up, romanticism it's also a modern experience, right? It's a reaction to Enlightenment, but it is the conquest of man by nature, in the sense of our spirit, our emotions. We succumb to nature, right? And we express it through our actions, through our emotions, ideas, poetry, music, etc. But I think nature is, on one hand, it's a source, of liberation and refuge. If I'm just thinking about something like Goethe and Werther, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which we read early on in the semester, right? Nature's liberating. Certainly moving into the 19th century, when we have urbanization, and a lot of this is also about the environment, right? And our changing relationship to the environment. Nature is a good thing. It's a place of refuge. It's a place of sobriety, right? Away from kind of, the troubles and challenges of urban modern life. But that also has a price, right? And if I'm thinking about Conrad's Heart of Darkness, nature is also very dangerous and dark, because it's our nature, right? And if we are conquered by human nature, and human nature has a dark side, right? That's the whole point. That's, I think, what Conrad's trying to tell us in the legendary, right, in the iconic kind of character of Kurtz. In Heart of Darkness. So it's also very dangerous, because if we move too far away from nature, which is maybe what happens because of Enlightenment, we're pulled back. And we're pulled back in a very unbound, in a very dangerous manner, right? In the sense of being uninhibited by any laws and rules and regulations.
Mm-hmm. I think even with that example, you did a really great job of sort of walking through to how our relationship to different ideas are historically specific. And so you see them shift, like even how nature is represented in art, that shifts during periods of modernity. I can imagine you probably had some pretty good discussions with the students. Are there any sort of discussions or debates that sort of happen time and again each time you teach it, or that really stand out?
Yeah. First of all, I think about the question of discontents, right, and determinism. Because a lot of students come at the end, especially, I don't know, something happened if we read Dostoevsky's Underground Man. Again, a lot of students are like giving up and like, oh my God, maybe Dostoevsky was right. Maybe this is too much for us, in a sense, right? This is too much. Modernity lays too much responsibility on the individual. Maybe we're unable to deal with it. Right, and it's kind of one of the questions Dostoevsky raised in the Brothers Karamazov. We don't read that; that's too long. But we read Underground Man, and that's always something that they come back to. And I said, look, it's not, the question isn't now, all right, so let's give up and go, but what are you going to go back to? You can't go back. It's a Pandora's box. You can't, it's like, you can't go back. That's the point. There is no, and again, part of this is such a contemporary course, even though we're going back 300 years to read things from the 18th and 19th century. I mean, these are the questions today. You cannot go back to a religious society, even if you wanted to, right? Even the most religious people in Israel, the Haredim, there's certain things, right? Technology, medicine, bureaucracy that even they embrace because they understand, right? Everyone understands in a way, and it doesn't matter if you're secular or religious, that there's certain things that we can't go back. So then the question is that they raise the students is, right, how do I move forward then? Do I go back? Do I, and it's all some kind of, a synthesis. And they have to somehow map, and it's an individual question. What do I take from the past, from traditions, right? And what do I crave for myself when I move forward? How novel, how modern am I? And that's the privilege of modernity, that it lets us make these decisions, right? No one could do these things 300 years ago. So that's one thing, I think, and it's all about agency today. The second has to do with women's rights, and that always comes up. It's a great conversation that we have. We read Ibsen, Doll's House, right? It's a wonderful play. And then we read Virginia Woolf. And there's always this question of what does it mean to be a feminist, right? Can men be feminists? Because we shift from a man writing about women's rights to Virginia Woolf writing about, and I raise the question, what changed, and and these are always questions. Also, I think that is a feminist in the 19th and 18th century, would she be considered a feminist today? And a lot of that also raises the questions of the limits of feminism and LGBTQ rights, and how we synthesize these questions today.
Okay. So speaking of how we think about it today, if we were to define ourselves as modern today, what do you think modernity today looks like and means? Just to give you a really small question.
Well, first of all, to answer that, you have to take the course. Right?
Okay.
But seriously, I ask myself that question every year, and I come up with a new answer. And again, that's it. It's that. If I needed, just this silver lining here would be, I think that it's a perpetual question that reinvents itself all the time. And that's the beauty, I think, of modernity and the modern experience, that we constantly shift and we constantly change our definitions and our expectations. And we can constantly reinvent ourselves and as individuals, but also as societies and nation states, and maybe on a global scale. And that's something that modernity allows us to do again, because again, it's that sensibility, it's that way of looking at the world, and knowing we can change it, right? But also thinking about that in a very critical manner and being aware of the potential hazards, and that I think is overall what I try to do in the course.
Okay. Well, Yoav, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you very much.